I was raised by both parents, and there was nine children. There was 6 girls and 3 boys. I grew up in a Christian home where my mom made sure we went to church, Sunday school, all those things. I met Jagata in the summer going into my senior year. He was the best boyfriend any young lady would want. And I think that he did love me. And so when he proposed to me and asked me to marry him, I said yes. But little did I know, that was when I let the devil into my life. This is actually a picture of our wedding reception. My mom gave it to us. She couldn't afford anything big, so she just gathered a few family and friends around the dining room table. I was pretty excited that day. I really thought that this was the beginning of something great. I thought this was the beginning of what every young teenage girl dreams of, a home with white picket fence and having a couple kids riding around the yard on bicycles. And that was my dream. That was my dream for us. But his family did not come to the wedding, neither did they come to the reception. Jagata showed up by himself. I didn't want to make him feel bad, so I didn't question him as far as why. When I look at it now, that should have been a sign, but I guess we just overlooked it. I really wish that I could just take this time back and all the way up to the day that he proposed, where I could have had an opportunity to say no. And my life, as well as my children's life, would be very different. Once we moved in with Jagata's grandmother, I realized that she didn't say much. She treated me okay, she just didn't talk to me a lot. Then one morning, after Jagata had left to go to work, his grandmother came in the kitchen while I was cleaning dishes. And I noticed that she looked out the window to make sure that he was gone. She turned around, and these were her words. She said, "Don't start nothing with him that you can't finish." And I'm like, what is she saying? But she was a woman of little words. And she turned around and she walked out the kitchen like she had never said anything to me. When his grandmother warned me that day, it literally stirred and spooked my spirit. And I felt like that she knew him better than I did. I believe they wanted to warn me because they probably had seen previous incident and it probably was pretty bad. I didn't know anything. I was just young and dumb. Jagata's reaction when I told him I was pregnant was excitement. He was very excited about having a child. Shortly after that, I would say maybe about another month and a half, I was sitting in his grandmother's house. Every day he gets home, he get out the car, he give me a smack on the lips.
How was your day?
Let me in.
But this particular day, he said, "Come on, let's go in the house." And I said, "What's wrong?" There was an old man who used to cut grass across the street. He accused me of looking across the street at this old man as if I was interested in him or something.
What are you really doing when I'm not here?
Jagata, I don't know what you're talking about.
He said, you waiting for me to come home, but you watching that man when he cutting grass and everything. And I was like, Jagata, that's not true, that's not true. He grabbed my hair and yanked it as hard as he could. The next thing I knew, I was on the floor and he's standing over me, screaming at me.
I expect my wife to be faithful. You understand?
I looked up and I saw his eyes. They were still his eyes, but they looked like they didn't have a care. It was just a blind look. It was as if, who are you? Suddenly, he just snapped out of it, walked away as if nothing had never happened. I didn't share with anybody, of course. And after that, I just, I was like, he went from Dr. Jekyll to Mr. Hyde. I mean, what made him act like this? And then the next day, it made me understand what his grandmother said even more clearer, because the next day, when I questioned him about it, he didn't want to talk about it. And he acted like it just did not happen. And I had never experienced anything like that in my life. So here I was that day. I was a changed person. This was not the man that I married. Generational abuse is real. The children of one generation watches the parents or the grandparents being abused, and they think that that's just the way it is. I feel like that's what happened to me. My grandmother and my mother, they were so silent about it. They never did anything about it besides, take pills. I definitely wasn't gonna tell nobody that my husband had hit me or anything like that. I might have did something wrong. It must have been me. All these thoughts start coming in your head to make you rationalize yourself that it wasn't his fault. When our son was born, I thought that was going to end all of the abuse. I really did. He was happy he had a son, and he was a good father. One day I was looking at him playing with our son, and I thought to myself, maybe this is what it took for him to change. But little did I know that it would get worse. I recall one day I was in the kitchen and I was preparing a meal. My son was in my arms and he was crying. And Jagata was upstairs sleeping. And so he hollered down a couple times for the baby to be quiet. I was trying my best to quiet the baby. The baby just kept crying.
Keep it down, damn it!
I'm working on it.
And I spoke back like I'm trying my best.
Keep it down!
But whatever it was enough to set him off, which don't take a lot to set him off. He came down the stairs, and I'm holding the child, and he just go off and swing and hit me. Not realizing that, I could have ducked and he would hit the child or anything like that. I immediately laid the child on the couch because I didn't want him to harm my baby. We began to fight. I was hitting him back. The next thing I know, there was a knock at the door. It was my neighbor. Jagata, being a coward, he would go immediately up the stairs so he wouldn't have to look at her. I think that was her way of stopping what was going on. I truly thank God for that type of neighbor we had. She saved my life. She don't want to see me hurt or the baby hurt or things like that. If I could turn back the time, I would have been left just for my son's sake, because he saw too much, and I believe it affected him a lot from that day forward. Jagata was a licensed minister. He was an ordained elder, and he was studying because he said God had called him to pastor. So at church, Jagata portrayed to be this man of faith. But at home, he was a different person. Jagata had a big sexual appetite, and it consumed him. They were never acts that a preacher, a man of God, would ask his wife to do. It was no longer about intimacy. It was all about him and him tormenting me in a different way. And so if I didn't have sex with him, it was gonna be hours and hours of him falsely accusing me of having sex with somebody else. But it was anything to get under my skin. Anything. He intimidated me and forced me into sexual acts that I did not want to participate in. The level of sexual abuse that I endured, I call it rape. Because I endured, if I can say it without saying it in a bad way, I lived in hell within them walls. No matter what happened the day before, when I woke up, I tried to forget about it and start afresh. I remember one day, Jagata got upset about something, and it became an argument.
Nobody's telling me what to do in my own home.
I don't have to be spoken to like this.
And instead of me standing there arguing with him when I know it wasn't gonna do any good, I decided to walk away. But before I could walk away, he went in the kitchen drawer and he grabbed a knife. And when he grabbed a knife, the fear just went to another level. Felt like that my whole head was gonna cave in and I was just gonna smother and die right there. He would give me a stare, an evil stare. And he would be like, I wish you were just dead. And so I ran out the door. And I ran next door to a friend of mine's house. And I told her, Jagata had put a knife on me. She asked me, did I want her to call the police? And I told her, I said, no, just call my mama. My sister Erica and my mother came to my house to get me. My mother pushed past him and went into the house. Then he threw her on the floor and started threatening her.
Don't you move, both of you.
Erica said that he was standing over my mom with a knife, demanding that if she don't leave, he was gonna kill her.
Now where is she? Tell me.
Jagata? Erica said that she just started screaming and hollering. And a man who lived in the neighborhood heard my sister screaming and hollering. And so he came over to see what was going on. And he said, let her up.
Son, you don't want to do this.
Jagata let my mom up, and then that's when her and Erica got out of there. As angry as he was, he probably would have stabbed my mom. After all of that, she still didn't tell me to leave him. She just pretty much just forgave him and we moved on. Just be a good wife no matter what he say or do. I used to pray every day. I say, Lord, don't let me die by the hands of this man. I knew that he wanted to kill me. I just didn't know when, and I just didn't know how to get out. Oh, wow. I hate looking at this picture. When I see this picture, all I see is evil. The look that he gave me when I snapped this picture, he looked at me as if If you don't walk away right now, you're going to regret it. I probably had my cell phone in my hand and just snapped the picture because I was always trying to make him happy, but nothing that I did or could do could make him happy. And so, you see it for yourself. When he getting ready for bed and he looking like this, it probably was a hard night for me. I believe that Jagada was living a fantasy life, tormenting me. I believe it brought excitement to his life, to see me always afraid, to see me always on edge, to see me always trying to appease him. I feel that he knew that I was really afraid of him because he lived to make me miserable. I recall one night, Jagada was reading and studying his Bible. And when he studied, he didn't just study with a Bible, he studied with other books and dictionaries and things like that. I never could understand how somebody so evil could even look at the Bible. And so I began to tell him that what he was doing was dangerous and that God was going to deal with him.
You're going to have to answer for your actions, Jagada.
One thing the Bible say that a husband's supposed to love his wife like Christ loved the church. I said, but you act like you hate me. And I think something hit him. I can't say what it was. And so he laid there for a minute. He just got up, went and got him a box and put all his books and Bibles and stuff in it and put it in the shed. I asked him why. He told me he just didn't want to have anything to do with the Bible anymore. I think that he did it because he knew he was losing this battle between evil and good. And I think that night, evil won. Once he turned his back on God, I knew things was going to only get worse for me. One night, he called my mother's house. I didn't want to talk to him, but I did.
What do you want?
When he called, he sounded as if he was remorseful. And he was just begging for us to come back and how much he loved us and he's not going to do it again. Once I told him I didn't want to come back, I wanted to stay away, he began to tell me goodbye and he loved us. And the words he was saying and how he was saying it, I knew that he was talking about death.
Why would you say that?
And so I began to tell him, don't talk like that, don't say that, what's wrong with you? He said, if I can't have you, I just rather die. And so I began to tell him I'm on my way home. Soon as I opened the front door, I could smell the gas in the apartment.
Jagada?
He was actually sitting on the couch like his head back. And then I'm like, Jagada, are you okay? Are you okay? I'm okay. And then he stands up and, of course I go to hugging him. I'm like, don't do that no more. So when I looked up, I saw the curtain move. And when I did, I pulled him back and the window was wide open. He was not trying to kill himself. The gas was going right out the window. And he looked at me as if it got you back, didn't it? And he went up the stairs, end the conversation like it had never happened. And I feel like to this day that's how much control he knew he had over me. He knew all he had to do was some simple, stupid stuff because I didn't want to see him dead, even though he was trying to kill me. remember one day I had put our son on the school bus, and at that time we had a baby girl. After I came back from putting him on the bus, Jagada and our daughter was sitting on the couch. And so I sat down on the couch with them, and I began to ask him what was wrong. And he just began to tell me that he was tired of living and he didn't see nothing worth living. I got scared that he was going to try to do a murder-suicide or something like that. And so I just openly said, Jagada, I hope you ain't got no gun in this house. You promised me that we was not gonna have no gun in the house. So with me constantly talking and him not really saying I don't have one, it led me to know he had a gun.
Jagada, tell me where the gun is.
The more the time was passing, the more anxious I was becoming. So I convinced him to please show me the gun. I didn't let him know I was upset with him or anything because I didn't want it to go, in opposite direction. All I thought about was, he's gonna kill me. And so I lived for many, many years believing that I was gonna die by his hands. When I saw the gun, I began to just convince him that I don't want him to hurt me or hurt himself or anything. He told me that he's not finna do anything to me. He said, I'm not gonna go to prison for you. You ain't worth me going to prison for. He used to give me the look. You just worthless. I don't even know why I deal with you. That's the mindset. That's an evil, demonic mind to make you think you're greater than somebody else. Eventually, he gave me the gun. I just believe that if I had not talked him out that gun, our son probably would have came home today from school and his sister probably been there crying over 2 dead bodies. I do believe that. Jagada paranoia was getting worse and worse because he had figured out that I was talking to other people about our relationship. By this time, my parents and my siblings too, they all knew, that Jagada was abusive to me. I assumed that he knew that I was telling other people how bad things were at home. There was even a couple of times I caught him spying. I recall one day where I had just gotten home and my aunt, she had called me.
Hello?
And while we talking, the phone seemed like it was staticky. But then all of a sudden it got to where it was echoing.
Do you hear that?
Seemed like I hear somebody talking.
Do you hear that? Do you hear that? Do you hear that?
I said, just keep talking so I can see where it's coming from.
Hello? Hello?
As I went to where the sound was, it seemed like it's coming from up under the house.
Hello? Hello?
As I went down the stairs, I can still hear it, and it was coming from under the house.
Hello? Hello?
When I got under there and I saw the system set up, I was afraid because I'm like, what is this? It was one of those box tape recorders that you can't even find no more. And it had some wires going to a phone, like a house phone. Then those wires was going up through the house. And I told her, I said, you ain't gonna believe this. I said, but it's a recorder, a phone, and everything up under here. I believe he was spying to try to find some type of way that I was not faithful to him. And I believe it was a plot for murder. Now I got a reason to murder her. It appears to me that every abusive situation that I was placed in, it made me only think about what could he do next? And I knew that if I had a left, he was gonna stalk me to death. This is Erica and Steve. Mhm. As nice and humble and sweet as Erica was, Steve had her beat by 100%. Steve was one of the nicest guys ever. He was the best husband Erica could have ever dreamed of having. Erica, in the last 6 months of my marriage, she called me and asked me would I help her. You know, she wanted to study her Bible, and so we became really tight. I just always felt like that there was a special connection between me and Erica. We had been together for like 6 months, almost every day. Jagato knew how close we was. So looking at this picture, I wish that we would not have gotten that tight. Because then Jagato wouldn't have never went to their house. Never went to their house looking for me if me and her had not been together for about the last 6 months. I remember one night, so I was in another room saying my prayers for the night. And as I walked into the bedroom, Jagato was awake. And I could sense that it was going to be one of those nights. He wanted me to do something that I didn't want to do, something that he knew I didn't want to do. And, it wasn't even about the distastefulness of it. It's the way he demanded it. It's the way he said it. You going to do it or else. And then I'm looking in his eyes, and now the black is like turning like red. And I'm like, oh my gosh, this man is possessed. And I begged him not to do it, but he just didn't care. And when he was finished, he laid over and he went to sleep. And I told the Lord, I said, Lord, if you let me live to see in the morning, I'm out of here and I'm not coming back. When I was leaving, I heard this voice say, when you leave this time, cut off all communication, because if you don't, it's going to be your last time. I didn't tell my mama, I didn't tell none of my siblings or nobody where I was. I was in hiding for about 30 days. No communication from me. It ain't no telling what was going through his mind. But I knew that Jagato would hunt me down and kill me. There was no doubt about it. And I remember that I was so afraid. His whole purpose was about finding me. And so he started pretty much stalking my family. I remember about a week after he went to my sister's house looking for me, I got a phone call from my brother who was a police officer in Mobile. He told me there was a fire at my sister's home and I needed to get home. My brother tells us that Erica and Steve, they didn't make it. To hear that Erica and Steve was dead, it was almost like unreal. I felt like that my best friend was gone. And I felt like that I was no longer in my body. I felt like I had an out-of-body experience, and I felt like this can't be true, this is not true. So we had this emotion, this feeling where everybody was just hugging on each other and crying, and it was just a horrible scene, About an hour later, my brother came out and told us more bad news, that they believed somebody had broke in the house, and then he said they were shot and stabbed. I could feel myself like I was there, but it's like I wasn't there. I just didn't feel like I was me. I feel like a void. Something had been torn out of me. When I woke up the next morning, I still felt empty. I still felt void. I felt like somebody had just ripped my insides out. I was so in shock until I couldn't really cry, but I can feel the pain. My heart was just aching. I feel sad, I feel hurt. Not only do I hurt for them, I hurt for her children and her grandchildren. You know, it was early, probably 6 o'clock, and I almost wishing that it was a dream. You know, you wishing that you don't slept this off. You wake up and it's still real. That Sunday, my phone rang. It was my brother. He said, I think Jagada had something to do with Eric and Steve murder. And when he said that, I almost fell on my face. I almost fell out my chair on my face. And I was like, oh my God, I mean, I didn't have that idea. And evil as Jagada was, I never thought that he would be the one that killed Eric and Steve. Why? There's no purpose to that. And the first thing that I remembered was the very first day I left him, I was at Erica's house, and the police came and escorted me into hiding. And so I think that he chose Eric and Steve because he figured that they knew where I was. He was searching for me and looking for me because that was the last place he saw me. And he went to one of my sister's home that night, and pretty much he was begging her to tell where I was or to call me for him. And her husband ended up telling him, say, you know, she said she's not coming back. He just became furious.
Authorities say Pearson murdered Erica and Steve Langford Friday, then set their home on fire.
Did you kill Erica and Steven?
Did you?
No, I'm asking, did you?
No, I'm asking you, did you?
Then why did they have you in cuffs right now?
Ask them.
So are you saying you didn't do this?
That's right.
What gets me on there is it showed just how cocky he is and how smart mouth and nasty attitude, and that's what I had to deal with for 30 years. That throws it all back at you. Never gonna fault himself or blame himself. He didn't do anything, and that's how he always was. I believe he did it to hurt me, and so that I can live in, in pain the rest of my life. And I think he did it because he lost the control that he wanted to have over them to tell him where I was. And Jagada would get very angry about anything that he could not control. Once Jagada entered the house, Erica was in the kitchen and Steve was in the bed. And when he opened the door, he immediately shot her 3 times in her upper torso. Steve ran out the bedroom to see what was going on, and there he confronted Jagada with the gun, and Jagada ended up getting the best of him and shot him in his left temple. Jagada grabbed the biggest of the butcher knife, and while my sister was crawling on the floor, he stabbed her 4 times in her back. And they said that's what killed her. And then he set the piles of clothes on fire, which caused the house to catch a fire. They never found the gun, but they found a shotgun in the truck. And along with the shotgun was 2 long bullets. So I had talked to the lieutenant, and he told me that I believe that if he had gotten a hold to you, that he was going to use those bullets, one for you and one for him. And I realized that I probably was going to be Jagada's next victim. No. Why do I feel ashamed? But I do.
Why?
I don't know.
You feel ashamed because
I don't know. Mm. I just feel ashamed now that I've told my whole story. And people are always opinionated. I had to cut off a lot of people. And I think just knowing that my situation, my own personal situation, caused my sister and her husband to lose their lives. I don't know if the pictures did it or that last video did it, but it's just like something came over on me, you know. I know that it's not my fault. It's Jakeda's fault. It was never anything wrong with me. But it took me many years of torment, fear, walking on eggshells, paranoid, depressed. It took many years of that for me to realize it was never anything wrong with me. It was always you. I remember the week approaching the funeral. It was something that if I could have escaped attending, I would. I felt for a long time that I should have been the one that should have been in that casket. I didn't know if I was going to come out alive or not. But once I came out alive, I made a promise. One of my vows was I told Erica I would not let her name go down in vain. In 2015, I started an organization. Our motto is not one more domestic violence victim. When someone wants to get out of a bad situation, we're their hands and their feet. We help them to get to where they need to go. For a long time, I thought about, my sister died for me, and it was so, it was so hard to deal with the fact that what was meant for you, somebody else had to get it. And so for a long time, I lived under so much guilt. But the good Lord, He delivered me from the guilt and the shame.
Living with my scars is hard because you wouldn't want to think somebody that you considered your best friend could do something like that. I opened my eyes and there was fire all over the room, everywhere. I thought, okay, I'm gonna die in here.
Evil rarely announces its arrival with a dramatic flourish. It does not wait in the shadows of deserted alleyways, nor does it always wear the face of a scowling stranger to be avoided on a lonely street at midnight. The most terrifying manifestations of malevolence are those that walk comfortably in the daylight, wearing a warm smile and an aura of absolute normalcy. They are the neighbors who wave from their porches, the quiet men who attend local gatherings, the pillars of a community who seemingly have nothing to hide. This is the story of a darkness so profound, so deeply embedded in the fabric of everyday life, that it managed to orchestrate one of the most horrific series of atrocities in the history of the United States without anyone noticing until it was far too late. It is a narrative that forces us to question the very nature of trust and the terrifying reality of what can happen when a predator hides in plain sight, protected by the innocent assumptions of a society that refuses to believe a monster could live right next door. The true crime landscape is littered with stories of betrayal, but few cases illustrate the catastrophic failure of communal vigilance and systemic protection, quite like the events that unfolded in Houston, Texas, during the early years of the 1970s. Houston in the summer of 1973 was a city defined by its oppressive, unyielding heat. The kind of heat that slows down time, that makes the air shimmer above the asphalt, and drives people indoors to the sanctuary of air conditioning. It was a sprawling, rapidly growing metropolis, a place of opportunity and expansion, but also a place where it was incredibly easy to slip through the cracks. In this era, the concept of a serial killer was not yet deeply ingrained in the public consciousness. Law enforcement agencies were not equipped with the sophisticated psychological profiling tools or the interconnected databases that exist today. The 1970s were a time of cultural transition, a period marked by youth rebellion, wanderlust, and a generation of teenagers who often left home in search of adventure or independence. This societal backdrop provided the perfect camouflage for a tragedy of unimaginable scale. When teenage boys began disappearing from the neighborhoods of Houston, specifically the working-class enclave of the Heights, the alarm bells that should have deafened the city remained devastatingly silent. The disappearances did not happen all at once. They were a slow, agonizing trickle of vanished lives that began to haunt the families left behind. A boy would go out to a local store and never return. Another would leave for a part-time job and simply evaporate into the humid Texas air. For the mothers and fathers of these missing youths, the days turned into weeks, and the weeks bled into months of unbearable uncertainty. They paced their living rooms, stared at empty beds, and desperately pleaded for help. However, when these terrified families approached the authorities, they were met with a wall of bureaucratic apathy that would eventually be recognized as one of the most catastrophic failures in the history of Texas law enforcement. The police, viewing the situation through the lens of the era, largely dismissed the missing boys as runaways. They reasoned that these were simply rebellious youths seeking to escape the confines of their homes, destined to return when they ran out of money or luck. There was no widespread search, no public panic, no task forces assembled to connect the dots. The authorities fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the crisis, operating under the fatal assumption that teenage boys were immune to the kind of systematic predation usually associated with more vulnerable demographics. This tragic miscalculation allowed a predator to operate with absolute impunity, treating the neighborhoods of Houston as a private hunting ground where the prey was not only abundant, but utterly ignored by the very people sworn to protect them. The epicenter of this unchecked nightmare was the Heights, a community where neighbors knew each other, where children played in the streets until dusk, and where the concept of strangers meant little. Within this seemingly idyllic setting operated the Coral Candy Company, a modest family business that produced sweet treats for the local population. The air around the facility often carried the comforting, sugary scent of pecan pralines and hard candies. At the heart of this enterprise was a man named Dean Arnold Coral. Born in 1939, Coral presented himself as the quintessential mild-mannered citizen. He was a polite, softly spoken man who still lived with his mother, projecting an image of harmless domesticity. He was meticulously clean, courteous to a fault, and always ready with a gentle smile for the locals. To the residents of the Heights, Dean Coral was not a threat. He was a generous neighbor, a fixture of the community who seemed to genuinely care about the well-being of the local youth. It was this meticulously crafted facade of benevolence that earned him a nickname that would later become synonymous with pure terror. The Candyman. Coral made it a habit to distribute free candy to the children and teenagers in the neighborhood. This simple, seemingly generous act was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. By handing out sweets, he bypassed the natural defenses of the community. Parents saw a kind-hearted local businessman bringing joy to their children. The youth saw a friendly, approachable adult who treated them with respect and offered them free treats. The moniker of the Candyman wrapped him in a cloak of absolute innocence. It is a psychological truth that we struggle to associate the sweetness of a candy maker with the grotesque brutality of a murderer. Coral weaponized this cognitive dissonance. He used the candy, the polite demeanor, and the respectable family business to build an impregnable fortress of trust. He was invited into homes, he chatted with mothers, and he became a trusted confidant to dozens of restless teenage boys who saw him as a cool, wealthy older friend rather than a lethal threat. Yet, beneath the veneer of the polite candy maker lurked a psychology completely detached from human empathy. Dean Coral was harboring a profound, sickening sexual deviation. His desires were anchored in a pathological need to dominate, control, and inflict agonizing pain upon young, vulnerable males. He did not simply want to kill. He wanted to orchestrate scenarios of absolute terror, where he held the power of life and death in his hands. The polite smile he offered to the mothers in the Heights was the same mouth that would later bark horrific commands in a soundproofed room. The hands that meticulously packaged pecan candies were the same hands that would meticulously construct wooden boards designed for the sole purpose of human torture. Coral's mind was a landscape of unspeakable depravity, a dark void that craved the suffering of the innocent to satisfy urges that defy rational comprehension. He recognized that to fulfill these grotesque fantasies, he needed a steady supply of victims, and the transient, often overlooked teenage boys of Houston provided the perfect, tragic opportunity. The sheer volume of his crimes required a level of cunning and logistical planning that elevated his depravity to an industrial scale. He realized that while his Candyman persona allowed him to lower the defenses of many, he could not physically abduct dozens of boys off the streets without eventually drawing attention. He needed a mechanism to bring the victims directly to his door, completely willingly and without a trace of suspicion. This necessity birthed the most insidious aspect of his operation, a network of betrayal orchestrated from within the youth community itself. He understood that a teenage boy might eventually grow wary of an older man inviting him over, but that same boy would never second-guess an invitation from his own peers, his schoolmates, or his trusted friends. Coral recognized the power of peer influence and set out to corrupt the very fabric of teenage friendship in his neighborhood, transforming the victims' own companions into instruments of their doom. As the scorching Texas summers came and went, the number of missing boys quietly climbed. The community remained largely oblivious, the police remained stubbornly dismissive, and the families of the vanished remained trapped in an agonizing purgatory of unknowing. The Candyman continued his daily routine, smiling at neighbors, helping his mother, and living a dual existence that is staggering to comprehend. For 3 long years, from 1970 to 1973, a silent massacre was unfolding behind closed doors. Dozens of young lives were being violently extinguished, their futures stolen, their voices silenced in rooms where no one could hear them scream. The bodies were spirited away in the dead of night, buried in shallow graves beneath the oppressive Texas dirt, hidden in rented boat sheds and along desolate stretches of coastline, waiting for a day of reckoning that seemed as though it might never arrive. That day of reckoning finally came, not through meticulous police work or a grand investigative breakthrough, but through a sudden, violent fracture within the killer's own carefully constructed world. It was the morning of August 8, 1973. The unrelenting summer heat was already beginning to bake the Houston pavement when the telephone rang at the local police precinct. The voice on the other end of the line was frantic, trembling with adrenaline and the weight of an unimaginable confession. A teenage boy had just placed a call that would permanently shatter the innocence of the city and unravel the darkest secret in its history. He reported that he had just shot and killed a man in self-defense at a house within the Houston metropolitan area. When law enforcement arrived at the scene, they encountered a chaotic aftermath. A young man was in custody, and the lifeless body of Dean Arnold Coral, the polite, mild-mannered Candyman, lay on the floor, riddled with bullets from a .22 caliber pistol. At first glance, the authorities processed the scene exactly as it had been reported, a tragic but straightforward case of a fatal altercation, a self-defense shooting that had ended the life of a seemingly respectable citizen. But as the adrenaline began to fade, the teenage boy who pulled the trigger began to break down. The facade cracked. The terrible burden of the secrets he had been carrying finally crushed him. Through sobs of anguish and terror, he looked at the officers and delivered a statement that would chill the blood of everyone in the room and echo through the annals of criminal history. He admitted to killing Coral, but then he uttered the words that would transform a routine homicide investigation into an excavation of pure horror. He confessed that the dead man on the floor was responsible for the murder of dozens of teenage boys, and that he, the boy sitting before them, knew exactly where all the bodies were buried. In that single, breathless moment, the illusion of the Candyman dissolved, The blindfold was ripped from the eyes of the Houston Police Department, and the horrifying reality of the deadliest mass murder in American history up to that point was finally dragged into the blinding, unforgiving light of day. To understand how so many young men could vanish without tearing the community apart, we must first look closely at who these boys were and the world they inhabited. The Houston Heights in the early 1970s was a working-class enclave, a neighborhood of modest homes and hardworking families where parents often worked long hours just to keep the lights on and food on the table. It was an era before mobile phones, before GPS tracking, and before the hypervigilant parenting styles of the modern age. Teenagers were expected to leave the house at dawn and return when the streetlights flickered on. They roamed the neighborhoods on bicycles, hitchhiked along the sweltering Texas highways, and sought out their own entertainment in a world that offered them a dangerous amount of unsupervised freedom. These were boys on the precipice of manhood, restless, fiercely independent, and eager to escape the suffocating boredom of their adolescent lives. They were not runaways by nature, but they were boys looking for a way out, seeking a few dollars, a cold beer, or simply a place to hang out away from the watchful eyes of adults. This intrinsic desire for freedom made them uniquely vulnerable. They were at an age where they felt invincible, oblivious to the fact that their casual independence was exactly what a predator was calculatingly observing. When one of these boys did not come home for dinner, the immediate assumption was not abduction or murder. The assumption, fostered by a generational misunderstanding and a police force unwilling to dig deeper, was that they had simply packed a bag, stuck out a thumb, and headed for the coast or across state lines to find their fortune. This tragic misread of adolescent behavior provided the perfect cover for a massacre. The victims of Dean Corll were not faceless statistics. They were brothers, sons, and best friends. They were boys who played in local baseball leagues, who struggled through high school algebra, and who spent their afternoons dreaming of buying their first car. The most devastating aspect of their disappearance was the sheer lack of suspicion they felt in their final moments of freedom. They were not dragged kicking and screaming from dark alleys by a terrifying stranger. They did not fight for their lives on the sidewalks of their neighborhoods. Instead, they walked willingly, often with smiles on their faces, right into the epicenter of their own destruction. They did this because the trap was baited not with violence, but with familiarity. The concept of stranger danger had been drilled into their heads, but what do you do when the monster does not look like a stranger? What do you do when the monster is someone you have shared a cigarette with, someone you have laughed with, someone who sits next to you in homeroom? Corll understood that to bypass the natural, biological alarms that warn us of danger, he could not be the one to issue the invitation. He needed proxies. He needed faces that these boys trusted implicitly. He needed to corrupt the sacred bond of teenage friendship and turn it into a weapon of mass abduction. This psychological warfare was perhaps his most insidious achievement, ensuring that his victims felt completely safe right up until the very second the lock clicked shut on the door of his home. To execute this monstrous logistics network, Corll cultivated two teenage accomplices who would become the architects of their peers' doom. The first was David Owen Brooks. Brooks was an 18-year-old high school dropout who had known Corll since 1965, long before the killings reached their fever pitch. Their relationship began when Brooks was just a middle schooler, attending a local church where Corll also spent time, projecting his false aura of moral upstanding. Over the years, Corll slowly, methodically groomed Brooks. He showered the boy with attention, gifts, and the kind of adult validation that a rudderless teenager desperately craved. Corll became a mentor figure, a provider of resources, and eventually, the puppet master who would slowly erode every moral boundary within the young man's mind. The transition from a troubled teenager to an active participant in serial murder is a terrifying psychological journey. It does not happen overnight. It happens through a gradual desensitization to violence, a slow normalization of the grotesque, and a toxic dependency on the man pulling the strings. Brooks found himself entangled in a web of complicity, participating first in the minor transgressions, then the sexual deviations, until the leap to accessory to murder seemed not like a horrifying plunge into darkness, but simply the next logical step in his relationship with the Candyman. He became the scout, the familiar face that could approach a boy at a local hangout and strike up a conversation without raising a single red flag. If David Brooks was the first shadow cast by Coral, Elmer Wayne Henley Jr. was the absolute darkness that followed. Henley was only 17 years old, a charismatic, confident teenager who had dropped out of school and was known around the neighborhood as a hustler, a boy always looking for an angle or a quick buck. He was introduced to Coral through Brooks, and the dynamic of the murderous trio shifted dramatically. Henley was not just a passive participant. He brought an aggressive, entrepreneurial spirit to the grotesque enterprise. Where Brooks might have been motivated by a long-standing, twisted loyalty and dependency on Coral, Henley was driven by something far more cold and transactional. He was a teenager with a terrifying capacity for compartmentalization, able to switch off his empathy completely and view his own friends, classmates, and acquaintances not as human beings, but as commodities to be traded for cash. The introduction of Henley escalated Coral's operation from a sporadic nightmare into a highly efficient, systematic hunting network. Henley knew everyone in the Heights. He knew the boys who were desperate for work, the boys who were having trouble at home, the boys who would eagerly jump into a van if promised a good time. He used this social capital with devastating effectiveness, scanning his own social circle to identify the most vulnerable targets, calculating their worth not in friendship, but in the bounty they would bring him once he delivered them to the slaughterhouse. The mechanism that fueled this machinery of death was staggeringly mundane: cold, hard cash. Dean Coral paid David Brooks and Elmer Wayne Henley Jr. anywhere from $200 to $500 for every boy they successfully lured to his home. To fully grasp the sheer depravity of this arrangement, one must understand the economic reality of the early 1970s. $500 was a staggering sum of money, especially for a high school dropout from a working-class neighborhood. It was enough to buy a used car, to fund weeks of partying, to provide a teenager with a level of financial independence that felt like absolute power. For this price, Brooks and Henley sold the souls of their friends. They put a price tag on human life and found it to be completely acceptable. The transactional nature of these crimes adds a layer of horror that goes beyond the physical violence. It speaks to a profound, sickening corruption of the human spirit. These two teenagers would sit at local diners, drinking milkshakes and sizing up the boys sitting at the next table, silently calculating their bounty. They would look into the eyes of a friend who trusted them, smile, and formulate a plan to lead that friend directly to a torture chamber, all while mentally spending the blood money they would receive for the betrayal. It was a monetization of murder that turned the streets of Houston into a terrifying marketplace where innocent lives were bought and sold under the bright Texas sun. The methodology they employed to spring the trap was brutally simple and tragically effective. There was no need for force or coercion in the initial stages. Henley or Brooks would casually approach a target, often someone they had known for years. They would leverage the typical desires of any teenage boy. They would offer a ride in a cool car. They would promise a party with unlimited beer and marijuana, free of adult supervision. Sometimes, they would prey on a boy's ambition, offering the prospect of a high-paying part-time job helping to move boxes at a warehouse or do some landscaping work for a wealthy older friend. The victim, seeing only a buddy offering a good time or a way to make some cash, would eagerly accept. They would climb into the passenger seat, completely unaware that they had just crossed the threshold between life and death. During the short drive to Coral's residence, the atmosphere in the vehicle would be light, filled with the typical banter of young men with their whole lives ahead of them. The victims felt relaxed, secure in the presence of their peers. When they finally arrived at the destination, they walked through the front door voluntarily, stepping out of the mundane reality of 1970s Houston and into a nightmare beyond human comprehension. They were offered a drink, perhaps a beer laced with heavy sedatives, and as the drugs began to cloud their minds, the horrifying realization would slowly dawn on them that the friends they trusted had delivered them into the hands of a monster. The ultimate betrayal was complete, and the doors of the Houston mass murders swung shut, sealing their fate in silence. The threshold of Dean Coral's residence represented the definitive boundary between the sunlit reality of 1970s Texas and a subterranean nightmare from which there would be no return. When a teenage boy stepped through that front door, often accompanied by the reassuring presence of Elmer Wayne Henley Jr. or David Owen Brooks, he was entering an environment carefully engineered to disarm and pacify. The interior of the house did not resemble a dungeon. It looked entirely unremarkable, featuring the mundane furnishings of a modest, middle-class suburban existence. This aggressive normalcy was the final layer of the trap. The victim, expecting a casual gathering, a few drinks, or a conversation about a potential job, would settle into the living room, his defenses completely lowered. He was among friends, or at least in the company of a respectable older man who had earned the trust of the neighborhood. The hospitality offered in those initial moments was the catalyst for the horrors to follow. Coral, maintaining his mild-mannered facade, would offer the young guest a beverage, typically a cold beer to combat the oppressive Houston heat. This drink, however, was heavily laced with central nervous system depressants, most commonly Valium. The victim would consume the beverage without a single reservation, completely unaware that he had just ingested the chemical agent of his own paralysis. The onset of the drug was not instantaneous, but terrifyingly gradual. The boy would begin to feel an uncharacteristic heaviness in his limbs, a thick fog clouding his cognitive functions, and a sudden, overwhelming lethargy that anchored him to his seat. The world around him would begin to blur, the cheerful banter of his supposed friends fading into a muffled, distorted echo. It was in this disorienting twilight between consciousness and incapacitation that the true nature of his predicament would finally reveal itself. He would attempt to stand, to express confusion or alarm, only to find that his muscles refused to obey the frantic commands of his brain. His body was shutting down, rendered entirely defenseless, transforming him from a vibrant, independent youth into a captive audience for a monster. As the victim struggled against the chemical weight pulling him into darkness, the atmosphere in the room would undergo a chilling metamorphosis. The friendly demeanor of the Candyman evaporated, replaced by a cold, predatory intensity that bore no resemblance to the man who handed out sweets on the streets of the Heights. More devastating than Coral's transformation, however, was the reaction of the victim's peers. The paralyzed boy, desperately scanning the room for an anchor, would look to Henley or Brooks for help, expecting to see shared panic or a rush to his aid. Instead, he would find only stoic observation or, worse, active participation in his subjugation. The realization that he had been systematically hunted and delivered to his executioner by the very boys he considered friends was a psychological violence that preceded the physical torture. It shattered his entire understanding of trust and reality. He was entirely isolated, trapped within his own failing body, surrounded by architects of his impending doom. Once the sedatives had achieved their purpose, ensuring the victim possessed absolutely no capacity for physical resistance, the logistics of the nightmare commenced. The helpless teenager was dragged or carried from the mundane setting of the living room into the specialized epicenter of Coral's depravity. This transition marked the end of any remaining illusions. The victim was brought before the primary instrument of Coral's sadistic obsession, a structure that the killer had meticulously designed and constructed for the singular purpose of human agony. This apparatus was the torture board, a grim testament to the industrial scale of Coral's malice. It was a heavy, robust slab of plywood, custom-built to accommodate the dimensions of a young adult male. It was not a makeshift restraint, but a carefully engineered platform of suffering, complete with heavy metal chains and thick leather straps strategically positioned to immobilize every limb. The incapacitated victim was hoisted onto this rigid wooden surface, his back pressed against the unforgiving grain of the plywood. The metallic clinking of chains and the tightening of leather belts echoed in the confined space, each sound a definitive seal on his captivity. His wrists and ankles were secured with brutal efficiency, pulling his body taut and exposing him entirely to the whims of his captor. Bound to the board, the victim was stripped of all agency, reduced to a completely helpless vessel upon which Coral could project his darkest psychological deviations. The board was the absolute center of the room, turning the agonizing destruction of a human life into a grotesque spectacle. The complete immobility forced upon the victim amplified his terror exponentially. He could not fight, he could not flee, and he could not even turn his face away from the nightmare unfolding before him. He was anchored to the wood, forced to endure the agonizing anticipation of what the monster standing over him was about to do. The prolonged ordeal that followed was defined by a calculated, methodical application of severe trauma. Coral did not rush his atrocities. He savored them, stretching the suffering over an agonizing expanse of time that could last for several hours or even extend into multiple days of relentless torment. The physical violations began with brutal sexual assaults, an expression of complete dominance and humiliation designed to entirely dismantle the victim's sense of self and bodily autonomy. But the sexual violence was only the foundational layer of a much broader architecture of pain. Coral possessed an array of tools intended to inflict maximum sensory devastation. He utilized heavy pliers to forcibly extract the teeth from the mouths of his conscious, terrified captives. The sheer, visceral agony of such an extraction, performed without anesthetics and upon a victim unable to thrash or defend himself, is an almost incomprehensible level of torture. He systematically pierced their skin with sharp needles, driving the metal deep into sensitive tissues to elicit fresh waves of shrieking panic. Furthermore, he incorporated electricity into his repertoire of suffering, applying crude but devastating electrical shocks to the bound youths, sending violent, involuntary convulsions coursing through bodies that were otherwise chained tight. This deliberate escalation of physical agony was designed to push the human nervous system to the absolute brink of its endurance without allowing the mercy of immediate death. Yet, the physical destruction was inextricably linked to a profound psychological sadism. Coral fed upon the desperation and terror of his captives. He demanded vocalizations of their suffering. He forced the agonizingly bound teenagers to beg for their lives, to plead for a cessation of the pain, to cry out in the desperate, vain hope that their tormentor possessed some hidden reservoir of mercy. The sound of their pleading, the raw vocal manifestation of their broken spirits, was the ultimate prize for the killer. He orchestrated these scenarios of absolute powerlessness to satisfy a deep, pathological void within himself. For hours on end, the air in that room was thick with the scent of fear, the metallic tang of blood, and the relentless, echoing pleas of boys who slowly realized that their begging only fueled the fires of their captor's obsession. They were trapped in a sensory vacuum where time lost all meaning, where every passing minute was measured entirely by the introduction of a new, unimaginable pain, and where the outside world, the sunny streets of Houston just beyond the walls, felt like a distant, unreachable universe. The culmination of this horrific process occurred only when Coral had entirely exhausted his capacity for sadistic gratification. When the torture ceased to provide the desired psychological return, or when the logistical need to clear the board for the next victim arose, the final execution was carried out with a terrifying, unceremonious efficiency. There was no grand finale, only the brutal termination of a life already pushed beyond the limits of human endurance. Coral would step behind the head of the board and secure a thick rope around the victim's neck, applying a slow, deliberate pressure, strangling the remaining breath from the boy's lungs. Alternatively, he would press the cold steel barrel of a .22 caliber pistol against the victim's head or chest and pull the trigger, the sharp crack of the gunshot acting as a definitive punctuation mark to the hours of agony. The absolute lack of hesitation in these final moments highlighted the terrifying reality that, to Dean Coral, these vibrant young men were nothing more than disposable objects, biological playthings to be discarded once they were broken beyond repair. The aftermath of the executions required a shift from sadistic indulgence to cold, calculated logistics. The Houston mass murders remained undetected for years precisely because Coral and his accomplices treated the disposal of the bodies with an industrial, methodical precision. Once the victim was deceased, the chains were loosened, and the lifeless form was removed from the blood-stained plywood. The process of erasure began immediately. The bodies were tightly wrapped in thick, heavy-duty plastic tarpaulins, creating a waterproof and visually impenetrable cocoon around the remains. To mitigate the inevitable biological processes of decomposition and to mask the telltale odor that might alert neighbors or authorities, they heavily dusted the wrapped corpses with caustic lime powder. This chemical agent served to hasten the breakdown of tissue while simultaneously neutralizing the scent of decay, a crucial step in maintaining the secrecy of their continuous slaughter. The final phase of the operation was the transportation and concealment of the packaged remains. Under the cover of darkness, utilizing the vast, sprawling geography of the Texas landscape, the trio transported their victims to 3 primary dumping grounds. The most heavily utilized site was a rented boat shed located in southwest Houston, a mundane, unremarkable storage facility that Coral transformed into a crowded, subterranean mass grave. Beneath the dirt floor of that shed, row upon row of plastic-wrapped youths were buried in shallow trenches, lying in silent proximity to one another. When the shed became too crowded, or when the logistical circumstances demanded a change of scenery, they drove the bodies out to the desolate stretches of High Island Beach near Galveston, burying them deep beneath the shifting sands where the ocean winds would erase their tracks. Others were transported to the remote, heavily wooded areas surrounding the Rayburn Reservoir, interred beneath the dense undergrowth far from the prying eyes of civilization. The earth swallowed these boys, hiding the physical evidence of Coral's monstrous reign, while the city above them continued its daily routines, completely oblivious to the sprawling cemetery of stolen youth that was growing silently beneath its feet. The machinery of a serial predator's operation is often built on an incredibly fragile foundation of rigid routine and absolute control. For 3 years, Dean Arnold Coral had maintained his horrifying ecosystem of abduction and murder by strictly adhering to a specific set of parameters. He knew exactly what he wanted, he knew how to obtain it, and his accomplices knew the rules of engagement. But the very nature of human unpredictability dictates that even the most meticulously constructed nightmares are vulnerable to a single, chaotic variable. That variable arrived on the suffocatingly hot night of August the 7th, 1973, introducing a fatal flaw into the Candyman's flawless design and setting the stage for a violent implosion that would finally end the massacre. The catalyst for this sudden collapse was not a brilliant investigative maneuver by local authorities or a sudden crisis of conscience from within the killer's dark circle. Instead, it was a profound miscalculation by Elmer Wayne Henley Jr., a deviation from the established predatory protocol that instantly transformed the master of the house from a calm, calculating murderer into a frantic, cornered animal. On that fateful evening, Henley arrived at Coral's residence intending to orchestrate another horrific delivery. He brought with him a young male friend named Timothy Curley, a teenager who perfectly matched the physical profile that Coral obsessively targeted. Had Timothy arrived alone with Henley, he would have undoubtedly become another tragic addition to the hidden graveyards of the Texas coast. However, Henley had made a seemingly casual decision that would inadvertently shatter the entire operation. He had invited a young woman named Rhonda Williams to join them for the gathering. To anyone outside the terrifying reality of the Coral household, a teenage boy bringing a male friend and a female friend to a party was the epitome of adolescent normalcy. But within the walls of that specific house, the presence of a female was an explosive, catastrophic anomaly. Coral's pathology was rigidly focused on the domination and destruction of young males. Women did not factor into his twisted fantasies. They represented an entirely alien element that he could not control and had no desire to victimize in his usual manner. More importantly, the presence of a girl represented an unmanageable risk to his carefully guarded secret. When Coral saw Rhonda Williams step through his front door, the carefully maintained facade of the polite, accommodating older gentleman disintegrated instantly. The psychological sanctuary he had built for his atrocities was violated. His reaction was not merely annoyance, it was a profound, dangerous fury driven by paranoia and the sudden loss of absolute control over his environment. He recognized immediately that his adolescent accomplice had become reckless, treating the slaughterhouse as a casual hangout spot rather than the highly restricted domain of a serial killer. The tension in the house spiked to suffocating levels. Coral viewed Rhonda not as a potential victim to be savored, but as a severe liability that needed to be eradicated immediately to protect the operation. And if Henley was foolish enough to bring a liability into the sanctuary, then Henley himself had become a threat. The dynamic of the room shifted from a predatory alliance to a frantic, paranoid hostage situation. Coral decided in those tense moments that the only way to re-establish order and ensure his continued freedom was to eliminate all three of the teenagers present, purging the house of both the intended prey and the careless accomplice who had endangered his life's work. The transition from a tense gathering to absolute horror unfolded with a terrifying efficiency that Coral had perfected over dozens of murders. Utilizing his standard method of subjugation, Coral managed to introduce heavy sedatives into the systems of the unsuspecting guests. Timothy Curley and Rhonda Williams, completely unaware of the lethal danger they were in, succumbed to the chemical weight of the drugs, their bodies shutting down and slipping into a deep, vulnerable unconsciousness. But Coral did not stop with the newcomers. Turning his wrath upon his own lieutenant, Coral overpowered Elmer Wayne Henley Jr., forcefully binding him alongside the two incapacitated teenagers. The betrayal was absolute. The teenage boy who had sold the souls of his peers for a few $100s suddenly found himself stripped of his favored status, reduced to nothing more than another piece of meat waiting for the slaughter. As the night deepened, Coral secured all three of them, leaving them helpless on the floor of the house. For Henley, the hours that followed were an exercise in unimaginable psychological torture. Unlike the dozens of victims who had preceded him, Henley was not confused about his circumstances or harboring a desperate hope that this was all a terrible misunderstanding. He knew exactly what the man in the next room was capable of. He possessed intimate, first-hand knowledge of the wooden torture board, the chains, the leather straps, and the excruciating methods Coral used to extract the maximum amount of pain from his captives before ending their lives. Henley lay there, bound and terrified, forced to contemplate the agonizing reality that he was about to experience the very same horrors he had facilitated for so many others. He knew that Coral would not offer him a quick death. He knew that the killer's fury over the disruption of his sanctuary would manifest in a prolonged, brutal retribution. Coral made his intentions explicitly clear, looming over the bound teenagers and menacingly detailing his plans to sexually assault and slowly murder every single one of them. The house, usually a place where Henley felt a twisted sense of power and financial security, had transformed into his own personal death row. The stifling darkness of the Houston night eventually gave way to the pale, unforgiving light of the morning of August the 8th. The situation inside the house had reached a critical impasse. Coral, perhaps exhausted from the adrenaline of the unexpected disruption or simply savoring the anticipation of the violence to come, had allowed the morning to arrive without executing his horrific threats. This delay provided the desperate teenager with a narrow, fleeting window of opportunity. Henley realized that physical resistance was impossible while he remained bound. He also knew that pleading for mercy would only fuel Coral's sadistic ego, a lesson he had learned by watching countless other boys beg for their lives to no avail. To survive, Henley had to employ the only weapon he had left, which was his intimate understanding of the killer's psychology. He had to manipulate the monster's arrogance. When Coral finally approached the captives that morning, ready to begin the agonizing process of torture, Henley initiated a desperate psychological gamble. He suppressed his terror and projected an aura of profound remorse and absolute submission. He began to apologize profusely to Coral, framing his decision to bring the girl to the house as a stupid, thoughtless mistake born of adolescent ignorance rather than intentional defiance. He played directly to Coral's need for dominance and respect, positioning himself once again as the subservient, loyal apprentice who had momentarily lost his way. The crucial turning point of his deception was his offer of assistance. Henley coldly promised Coral that if he were released, he would eagerly help him torture and murder Timothy and Rhonda. He essentially offered to buy his own life by enthusiastically participating in the execution of his friends, reaffirming his commitment to the sick enterprise that bound them together. It is a chilling testament to the blinding nature of arrogance that Dean Coral, a man who had successfully manipulated and murdered dozens of people without detection, fell for this desperate ruse. Perhaps he truly believed that his psychological hold over the teenager was absolute. Perhaps the sheer logistical difficulty of managing 3 bound captives simultaneously made the offer of assistance too tempting to refuse. Or perhaps his narcissistic belief in his own invulnerability simply clouded his judgment. Whatever the underlying reason, the Candyman made a fatal miscalculation that would cost him everything. Believing that he had successfully reestablished dominance and secured his accomplice's compliance, Coral reached down and loosened the restraints binding Elmer Wayne Henley Jr., setting the teenager free. The moment the bonds fell away, the illusion of the subservient apprentice vanished. Henley did not move to assist in the torture. He moved entirely for his own survival. Adrenaline, fueled by hours of absolute terror, flooded his system. He knew that he had only seconds to act before Coral realized he had been deceived. The house erupted into a violent, chaotic struggle. The physical confrontation between the master and the accomplice was frantic and desperate, a life-or-death grapple in the same rooms where so many others had silently perished. During the chaotic scuffle, Henley's desperate eyes locked onto the instrument of Coral's ultimate authority, the .22 caliber pistol that the killer used to finalize his atrocities. Driven by pure, animalistic survival instinct, Henley lunged for the firearm. His fingers closed tightly around the cold steel of the grip. In that split second, the balance of power shifted permanently. The teenager leveled the barrel of the weapon directly at the man who had corrupted his youth, the man who had orchestrated a massacre, and the man who, just moments before, had promised to subject him to unimaginable agony. Henley did not hesitate. He squeezed the trigger, the sharp, deafening crack of the gunshot shattering the quiet morning air of the Houston suburbs. He fired again and again, the recoil jolting his arm as he emptied the weapon into the body of the serial killer. 6 consecutive bullets tore through Dean Arnold Coral, ripping through his flesh and dropping him heavily to the floor. The abrupt silence that followed the gunfire was deafening. The Candyman, the architect of one of the most prolific and horrific killing sprees in American history, lay dead in his own home, executed by the very network he had created to sustain his bloodlust. The reign of terror that had silently consumed the youth of Houston for 3 agonizing years was permanently extinguished in a sudden burst of violent desperation. The monster had been slain, not by a hero, but by a monster of his own making, bringing an abrupt and bloody conclusion to the long, dark night of the Houston mass murders. The immediate aftermath of the gunfire inside the Houston residence was defined by a profound, surreal quiet that contrasted sharply with the violent chaos that had just transpired. Elmer Wayne Henley stood over the lifeless body of Dean Arnold Coral, the smoke slowly clearing from the barrel of the .22 caliber pistol, his hands trembling with a mixture of adrenaline, shock, and the staggering weight of realization. The teenage boy who had pulled the trigger knew instinctively that he could not simply walk away from the scene, nor could he hide the events that had unfolded behind those suburban walls. With a frantic sense of urgency, he reached for the telephone and dialed the local emergency services, his voice cracking as he reported that a man had been shot. Within a remarkably short span of time, the wailing sirens of police cruisers cut through the humid morning air, shattering the mundane routine of the neighborhood and converging on the house that had served as the command center of a horrific secret empire. When the first patrol officers stepped through the front door, their training and expectations immediately framed the scene through a conventional lens. They observed a young man in a state of high agitation and the bloody corpse of an older man lying motionless on the floor. The initial assessment of the situation pointed toward a straightforward, if tragic, case of self-defense, a fatal escalation of a domestic or interpersonal dispute that had gone fatally wrong. The officers secured the weapon, placed the shaken teenager under temporary observation, and began the standard procedural tasks of securing a homicide scene. To all outward appearances, the police department believed they were dealing with an isolated incident, a violent anomaly in an otherwise quiet Houston suburb. They had no inkling, no structural framework, and no psychological readiness for the seismic revelation that was about to rupture their understanding of reality. As the hours ticked forward, the physical containment of the scene gave way to a psychological fracture within the teenage shooter. Elmer Wayne Henley sat in the confines of the interrogation room, the adrenaline slowly draining from his system, leaving behind the suffocating realization of what he had participated in and what he had just brought to an end. The facade of the confident, detached hustler completely dissolved. He began to weep uncontrollably, the tears and sobs breaking through his defenses as the sheer magnitude of the collective nightmares he had witnessed pressed down upon him. He looked at the investigators and delivered a statement that would instantly freeze the blood of every seasoned law enforcement officer in the room. He told them that he had indeed killed Coral, but that the man lying on the floor was responsible for the disappearance and murder of dozens of other children and teenagers. In that single, breathless confession, the scope of the investigation shifted from a localized homicide to the discovery of the most devastating serial killing spree in the history of the United States. The immediate reaction among the authorities was a mixture of profound skepticism and creeping horror. It was nearly impossible for the police to comprehend the scale of the claim Henley was making. However, the specificity and the raw, shattering grief in the boy's demeanor left no room to completely dismiss his words. Realizing the unprecedented gravity of the situation, the detectives shifted their posture from interrogation to urgent listening. Henley, possessing an intimate and terrifying knowledge of the landscape of the murders, offered to cooperate fully. He told the officers that the bodies of the victims were not scattered across distant states or lost to the open ocean, but were buried right here in the Houston metropolitan area, hidden in places that no one had ever thought to look. He became the reluctant guide to an underworld of his own creation, preparing to lead the police through a literal and metaphorical descent into the darkest corners of his past. The first and most critical destination on this grim itinerary was a rented boat shed located in southwest Houston. As the police convoy pulled up to the unremarkable storage facility, the mundane exterior offered no hint of the horrors contained within its walls. But as the officers stepped out of their vehicles and approached the specific unit identified by Henley, they were immediately met with a sensory assault that confirmed the horrific truth of his confession. A heavy, sickening stench of advanced decomposition hung thick in the air, a suffocating olfactory signature of mass death that could not be masked entirely by the lime powder sprinkled beneath the floors. The detectives unlocked the door and stepped inside, entering a subterranean theater of human tragedy. They realized immediately that they were standing on top of a mass grave, a makeshift cemetery hidden away in a commercial storage lot where human lives had been discarded with industrial indifference. The excavation of the boat shed began under a cloud of heavy grief and mounting public dread. Law enforcement personnel, forensic specialists, and crime scene technicians descended upon the site, working meticulously through the suffocating heat and the relentless stench to unearth the hidden remains. As they began to remove the dirt flooring, they encountered the grim physical evidence of Coral's methodical slaughter. Row upon row of thick, heavy-duty plastic tarpaulins were uncovered, each one wrapped tightly around the lifeless form of a young man. The technicians worked with agonizing slowness, cutting away the plastic to reveal the tragic reality inside. These were not abstract statistics, they were teenage boys, many of whom had been reported missing months or years earlier, their young lives extinguished in the prime of their youth. The sheer volume of the discovery was staggering. As body after body was exhumed, catalogued, and transported to the medical examiner's office, the final tally at the boat shed alone reached a horrific magnitude, cementing the site as one of the most prolific burial grounds of a serial killer in American history. Beyond the boat shed, Henley's chilling guidance led investigators to other forgotten corners of the Texas landscape. Teams were dispatched to the desolate stretches of High Island Beach near Galveston, where the shifting coastal sands had been utilized to conceal the remains of victims swept away from the city. Others were sent to the heavily wooded, isolated terrain surrounding the Rayburn Reservoir, where the dense undergrowth and remote geography had provided a quiet, undisturbed sanctuary for the disposal of evidence. At each location, the tragic pattern repeated itself. The earth yielded its silent occupants, bringing the total number of recovered victims to 28. The demographic profile of the dead was heartbreakingly consistent. Teenagers and young men, primarily between the ages of 13 and 20, whose only crime had been walking down a Houston street at the wrong time, trusting the wrong face, or falling into the well-laid traps of a predator who operated in plain sight. As the grim task of excavation concluded, the focus of the state shifted inevitably to the mechanics of justice, leading inexorably toward the courtroom trials that would attempt to provide a measure of accountability for an atrocity of this magnitude. The legal proceedings were enveloped in an atmosphere of intense public outrage, profound grief, and national media attention. The citizens of Houston and the families of the victims demanded answers as to how such a prolonged and devastating massacre could have unfolded beneath the nose of the community without detection. The courts were tasked with processing the unimaginable horror of the crimes and delivering sentences that reflected the unprecedented scale of the devastation. The legal system had to confront not only the actions of the dead mastermind, Dean Corll, but also the culpability of the living accomplices who had greased the wheels of his machinery of death. The trials for the two surviving participants, Elmer Wayne Henley Jr. and David Owen Brooks, played out against a backdrop of intense emotional friction. David Brooks, who had been the first to fall under Corll's spell years prior, faced the full weight of the prosecution as the evidence of his extensive involvement in the abductions and tortures was laid bare before the court. The defense faced an almost insurmountable task in attempting to mitigate the sheer volume of horror associated with his actions. Despite arguments regarding his age at the time of some of the earlier offenses and the psychological manipulation exerted by Corll over his younger associates, the court remained steadfast in its assessment of his culpability. The evidence clearly established that Brooks had willingly participated in the hunting, delivery, and subjugation of numerous young victims for financial gain and twisted loyalty. When the verdict was finally delivered in the trial of David Owen Brooks, the judicial outcome was definitive. He was convicted of murder and sentenced to serve a term of life imprisonment. Brooks was sent away to the harsh realities of the Texas penal system, where he would spend the remainder of his natural life isolated from the society he had victimized. For decades, he remained behind bars, a quiet, forgotten figure of a historical nightmare, until his life finally came to an end in prison due to cancer in the year 2020. His death closed a biological chapter of the tragedy, leaving behind a legacy defined entirely by his complicity in one of the darkest chapters of American criminal history, a stark reminder of how deeply a human soul can be corrupted when it surrenders its moral compass to a monster. The legal reckoning for Elmer Wayne Henley Jr. presented a complex and emotionally turbulent dynamic for the justice system. On one hand, Henley was undeniably a primary accomplice who had hunted his own friends, peers, and classmates, accepting cold cash to lead them directly into a torture chamber. On the other hand, he was also the catalyst for the end of the massacre, the desperate teenager who had turned his weapon against the master and pulled the trigger 6 times to save his own life and the lives of others, effectively breaking open a case that might have otherwise remained buried forever. The prosecution acknowledged his role in terminating Corll's reign of terror, but the sheer gravity of his active participation in multiple murders could not be overlooked or pardoned by the state. He was held fully accountable for the lives he had helped to steal, facing the unyielding judgment of a society demanding retribution for the 28 lost souls. The trial of Elmer Wayne Henley concluded with a sentence that ensured he would never walk the streets of Houston as a free man again. Because he had been implicated in multiple counts of murder, the court handed down a series of consecutive life sentences. When tallied together, Henley was condemned to serve 6 consecutive life terms, amounting to a staggering total of 594 years behind bars. It was a sentence designed to span multiple lifetimes, a symbolic and literal declaration that the crimes he committed were so heinous, so fundamentally destructive to the social fabric, that freedom was an absolute impossibility. He was transferred into the custody of the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, stepping out of the courtroom and into a permanent confinement that would consume the rest of his existence. The gavel came down, the trials concluded, and the legal chapter of the Houston mass murders was formally sealed, leaving behind a shattered community and a legacy of grief that no sentence could ever truly mend. The The true horror of a tragedy like the Houston mass murders does not dissipate simply because the perpetrator is dead, the accomplices are imprisoned, and the physical bodies have been exhumed from their dark graves. The echoes of such catastrophic violence reverberate far beyond the immediate courtroom verdicts and the initial waves of public shock, sinking deeply into the collective consciousness of a society forced to confront its own blind spots. When the full scale of Dean Corll's crimes was finally dragged into the unforgiving light of day in the late summer of 1973, the city of Houston and the nation as a whole were left staring into a profound moral abyss. It was an awakening that was as agonizing as it was overdue, forcing ordinary citizens, grieving families, and institutional authorities to examine the systemic failures that had allowed a monster to operate with absolute impunity for 3 long years right beneath their noses. The legacy of the Candyman is not merely a record of unprecedented brutality. It is a dark, permanent scar on the history of American law enforcement and a haunting reminder of how easily a community can fail its most vulnerable members when it chooses convenience over vigilance. To fully comprehend the societal impact of the case, one must confront the devastating reality of how the disappearances were handled during the years the killings were actively taking place. Throughout the early 1970s, when frantic parents walked into local police precincts to report that their teenage sons had failed to return home, they were met not with urgency or investigative rigor, but with a wall of institutional dismissal. The prevailing cultural narrative of the era, heavily influenced by changing generational dynamics and the rise of youth counterculture, painted teenagers as restless wanderers prone to sudden rebellion. Police officers, operating under outdated paradigms and overburdened by routine crime, routinely categorized these missing youths as voluntary runaways. To the authorities, a teenage boy packing a bag, hitchhiking down a highway, or disappearing for weeks at a time was a common occurrence, a minor social friction rather than a blinking red emergency. This institutional bias was a fatal miscalculation. It blinded law enforcement to the terrifying reality that a predatory network was actively hunting within their jurisdiction. While grieving mothers and fathers printed missing persons flyers and patrolled the streets on their own, the police departments filed away their reports, assuring them that their sons would eventually turn up when they ran out of money. This tragic apathy created an invisible shield around Dean Corll, allowing him to stockpile victims in plain sight while the very system sworn to protect them looked the other way. The unearthing of the mass graves at the Southwest Houston boat shed and along the coastal sands shattered this comfortable illusion once and for all. It forced law enforcement agencies across the United States to radically reevaluate how they processed missing persons reports, particularly those involving juveniles and young adults. The sheer volume of victims, 28 young lives extinguished before they had truly begun, served as a national wake-up call that could no longer be ignored or rationalized away. Law enforcement protocols underwent a grim, necessary evolution. The old assumption that a missing teenager was simply a runaway was dismantled, replaced by a growing recognition that young people were uniquely vulnerable to systemic predators who exploited the very freedoms of youth. Information sharing between different jurisdictions was slowly improved, laying the foundational framework for the coordinated, multi-agency task forces that would eventually become standard practice in modern serial killer investigations. The tragedy in Houston exposed the dangerous cost of bureaucratic indifference, permanently altering the legal and administrative landscape of missing children investigations in America and prompting legislative reforms designed to ensure that no future generation of missing youth would be so readily dismissed by the institutions meant to safeguard them. Yet, the administrative and legal reforms, while necessary, could do very little to heal the profound, irreparable emotional wounds inflicted upon the families of the victims. For the mothers, fathers, brothers, and sisters who had spent years wandering in the dark purgatory of uncertainty, the discovery of the truth brought a horrifying kind of closure. The agonizing hope that their son might still be out there somewhere, living a hidden life or traveling across the country, was violently extinguished by the grim reality of the exhumations. They had to face the unthinkable truth that their boys had not run away, that they had not abandoned them, but that they had walked into a trap baited with candy and friendship, falling victim to a calculated cruelty that defies human comprehension. The grief of those families was a complex, multi-layered trauma, compounded by the knowledge that many of their sons might have been saved if the authorities had only listened, if the community had only looked closer, and if the warning signs had been recognized before the death toll climbed into the dozens. The annual cycles of grief, the empty chairs at holiday dinners, and the perpetual sorrow of lost potential became an enduring legacy for dozens of households in Houston, a permanent reminder of a summer when the innocence of their world was stolen away forever. Beyond the immediate circle of the victims' families, the case left an indelible psychological mark on the cultural identity of Houston and the broader psyche of the American public. The 1970s were already a turbulent decade, marked by political disillusionment, cultural shifts, and a growing sense of societal unease. The revelation that a mild-mannered candy maker could orchestrate an industrial-scale slaughter of children in a quiet suburban neighborhood shook the foundational sense of security that people placed in their local environments. It challenged the comforting myth that evil always wears a recognizable disguise, that monsters live in dark caves or roam desolate highways far from the warmth of human society. Coral did not hide in the shadows. He lived in the light. He waved to his neighbors, he handed out sweets, and he presented himself as a pillar of polite domesticity. This revelation forced society to confront a terrifying psychological truth, that the greatest threats often wear the mask of absolute normalcy. The concept of the friendly neighbor, the helpful local businessman, and the trusted peer suddenly became charged with an underlying current of paranoia and suspicion. The innocence of the neighborhood was shattered, replaced by a cautious, guarded vigilance that would forever change how communities interacted with one another. The involvement of teenage accomplices added an especially dark and disturbing dimension to the societal reflection triggered by the case. The idea that young men like David Brooks and Elmer Wayne Henley Jr. could be so thoroughly corrupted, so completely stripped of their basic empathy that they willingly traded the lives of their friends and classmates for pocket change, was a profound shock to the moral conscience of the community. It forced educators, psychologists, and parents to examine the darker undercurrents of adolescent alienation, peer pressure, and the terrifying ease with which a vulnerable young mind can be manipulated into committing unspeakable acts. The case raised difficult, uncomfortable questions about the societal pressures bearing down on working-class youth in a rapidly expanding industrial city, where lack of opportunity, broken homes, and a desperate search for validation could create fertile ground for predatory grooming. Henley and Brooks were not born monsters. They were manufactured products of a toxic environment, corrupted by a master manipulator who understood precisely how to weaponize their teenage insecurities against them. Their participation served as a chilling warning about the hidden dangers lurking within peer groups, proving that the betrayal of trust can sometimes originate not from an unknown stranger in the dark, but from the very person sitting right next to you on the living room couch. Decades have passed since that stifling August morning in 1973 when the gunfire rang out in a Houston home and brought an abrupt end to the nightmare. The physical landscape of the city has evolved, the old neighborhoods have changed, and the generations that lived through the terror have grown old or passed away. Yet, the ghost of Dean Coral and the 28 young men whose lives he stole continued to cast a long, dark shadow over the history of true crime. The case remains a watershed moment, a grim benchmark against which subsequent atrocities are measured, reminding us of the darkest depths to which human depravity can sink when left unchecked by vigilance or morality. It stands as a solemn, tragic testament to the victims whose futures were violently erased, ensuring that their names and their stories are never entirely forgotten by history. In remembering them, we do not honor the monster who destroyed them, but rather we pay tribute to the fragile dignity of human life, acknowledging the profound responsibility we share to protect the vulnerable, to listen when the warning signs appear, and to remain eternally vigilant against the darkness that so often hides quietly in plain sight. Even when the courtroom gavels fell and the prison doors slammed shut behind David Brooks and Elmer Wayne Henley, the harrowing narrative of the Houston mass murders was far from complete. A tragedy of such staggering proportions does not simply evaporate because the legal system has processed its immediate actors. The physical exhumation of bodies from the subterranean vaults of the boatshed, the coastal sands of High Island, and the wooded terrain of the Rayburn Reservoir provided a grim accounting of the slaughter, but it also opened a new and agonizing chapter of uncertainty for numerous families whose children remained unaccounted for. While many of the recovered victims were successfully identified through dental records, clothing descriptions, and familial testimony, a chilling reality persisted beneath the surface of the forensic reports. Not every boy who vanished from the sunny streets of the city during those 3 dark years was immediately given his name back. The sheer decomposition of the remains, accelerated by the hasty burials and the caustic lime powder strewn across the packages, left several sets of human remains in a state that defied easy identification with the primitive forensic technology available in 1973. This lingering ambiguity transformed the conclusion of the criminal trials into a prolonged and silent purgatory for parents whose sons had disappeared into the orbit of the killer but whose physical identities could not be definitively matched to the exhumed graves. The machinery of justice had delivered its verdicts, but for these specific families, the fundamental question of what happened to their child remained shrouded in an unbearable and perpetual twilight, a wound that could never truly heal because the final proof of loss was forever denied to them by the destructive efficiency of the methods and the passage of agonizing years, making peace nearly impossible to achieve for those who waited faithfully at home while the world moved forward without them forever. As decades passed, the relentless march of technological innovation eventually brought a new kind of light to the dark corners of the investigation. The advent of forensic DNA profiling in the late 20th and early 21st centuries offered a glimmer of hope for resolving the remaining cold cases tied to the criminal network. Investigative agencies, working in tandem with dedicated forensic anthropologists and genealogy experts, began the painstaking process of examining the physical evidence preserved from the original exhumations. Bone fragments, teeth, and personal artifacts recovered from the burial sites were subjected to modern genetic testing methodologies that were entirely unimaginable to the detectives who originally walked through the doors of the storage facility. This scientific evolution was driven by an unyielding moral imperative stating that every human being whose life was stolen in that house of horrors deserved to have their name restored, and every grieving family deserved a definitive answer, no matter how many years had slipped away since the disappearance. The modern investigations demonstrated that history is never entirely dead and buried, and that the passage of time does not diminish the obligation of society to seek truth and closure for the victims of historical atrocities. Through genetic genealogy and advanced database comparisons, investigators continued to chip away at the remaining anonymous mysteries, determined to ensure that every single soul consumed by the tragedy was eventually recognized, remembered, and honored with the dignity of their true identity restored completely before the eyes of a grateful public that vowed never to let such darkness be forgotten again, while the judicial system continued monitoring all related archives to ensure absolute transparency across every single document pertaining to the dark legacy left behind by the killer and his accomplices who spent their days behind prison walls contemplating the full weight of their unimaginable crimes against humanity and the innocent youth of the American landscape forever marked by this sorrow. Yet, beyond the laboratory analysis and the ongoing quest for genetic identification, the true and lasting legacy of the Houston mass murders lives on in the fractured lives of the survivors and the families who bore the heaviest burden of the catastrophe. The siblings of the victims, children who grew up alongside a brother who simply vanished one afternoon, inherited a legacy of profound generational trauma. They watched their parents age prematurely under the crushing weight of unanswered questions, experiencing a childhood overshadowed by an invisible ghost that haunted every holiday dinner, every family gathering, and every quiet moment at home. The psychological architecture of these households was permanently altered by the sudden absence of a child, creating an atmosphere of perpetual hypervigilance, unspoken grief, and defensive protection. Parents who lived through the horror of 1973 carried an unbearable burden of guilt, second-guessing every decision, every missed warning sign, and every moment they allowed their son to walk out the front door into a neighborhood that seemed safe and familiar. This domestic trauma radiated outward, influencing how entire generations of local residents viewed their community, transforming a once open suburban environment into a space watched with guarded caution and quiet apprehension. The innocence that characterized suburban life in the post-war era was permanently stripped away, replaced by the sober realization that danger can wear the most disarming mask imaginable, operating openly in the bright sunlight while the rest of the world looks away in blind ignorance, until it is far too late to intervene effectively against the looming catastrophe unfolding right next door to unsuspecting neighbors who shared coffee and polite conversations with a man whose gentle exterior concealed a chilling void of absolute malice directed at the most vulnerable youth population of a rapidly expanding metropolis searching desperately for a place to belong within the sprawling geography of the American dream gone terribly wrong. The cultural resonance of the case also forced a fundamental reckoning within the broader media and true crime landscape, setting a dark benchmark for how society perceives and analyzes predatory behavior. Long before the era of modern internet sleuthing, 24-hour news cycles, and sophisticated psychological profiling, the atrocities committed by Dean Corll and his teenage accomplices exposed the terrifying efficiency with which a predator could exploit societal blind spots. It challenged the comforting narrative that serial killers are always lone wolves operating in isolated wildernesses or dark urban alleys, proving instead that the most destructive monsters can seamlessly integrate themselves into the fabric of daily life, hiding behind the polite smile of a local candy maker and weaponizing the trusted peer groups of their victims. This realization reshaped the narrative framework through which subsequent criminal cases were examined, teaching investigators to look beyond superficial appearances, to question institutional assumptions about runaways and missing juveniles, and to recognize the subtle and manipulative dynamics of grooming and peer-assisted abduction. The case became a cautionary tale studied by law enforcement professionals, criminologists, and sociologists alike, serving as a permanent and harrowing reminder of the systemic vulnerabilities that allow evil to flourish when vigilance fails and communities remain comfortably asleep during periods of social transition where young people seek independence without realizing the hidden perils lurking in plain sight across neighborhoods that prided themselves on neighborly trust and community. Solidarity, which proved entirely inadequate against an industrial-scale slaughterhouse operated quietly behind closed doors where innocent boys walked willingly into traps set by friends who sold their souls for quick cash and adult validation within a warped system of perverse loyalty that shattered the very foundation of youthful camaraderie and left an indelible stain upon the collective memory of a city forced to confront its darkest nightmare on a humid summer morning in 1970. 3 forever remembered in American true crime. In the final analysis, the story of the Houston mass murders is not merely an account of gruesome violence, extraordinary depravity, or the mechanics of a criminal investigation. It is, at its deepest core, a solemn meditation on human vulnerability, the fragility of trust, and the enduring resilience of the human spirit in the face of incomprehensible darkness. The 28 young lives that were violently extinguished in those suburban rooms represented a vast, unwritten future of potential, dreams, and relationships that were stolen away by a predatory force that operated without empathy or restraint. When we look back across the decades to that stifling summer of 1973, we are forced to confront the uncomfortable truths that the case lays bare, that trust can be corrupted, that institutions can fail, and that evil can walk among us wearing the friendly face of a neighbor. Yet, within that same dark narrative, there exists a stark counter-narrative of survival, accountability, and the relentless pursuit of truth. The young man who pulled the trigger to end the reign of terror, the detectives who sifted through the suffocating heat of the boat shed to recover the lost remains, and the families who kept the memory of their children alive through decades of unbearable pain all contributed to a collective refusal to let the darkness win complete victory over human decency, while the legal system and modern society continue remembering every single name etched into this historic tragedy, ensuring that their Stories are told with dignity and profound respect so that future generations will remain forever vigilant against predators hiding in plain sight across neighborhoods everywhere, ensuring complete remembrance of the souls lost during the darkest summer in the modern history of the United States, closing this chapter with enduring sorrow and eternal vigilance as we honor the memory of the victims now and forevermore in history. Books across the entire world. The final echoes of the gunshots that brought an end to the reign of terror of Dean Arnold Corll on that humid August morning in 1973 have long since faded from the streets of the Houston Heights, yet the spiritual weight of that catastrophe remains undiminished by the passage of time. When we reflect upon the sheer magnitude of the devastation, looking back through the lens of history at the 28 young lives that were so violently extinguished, we are forced to confront uncomfortable truths about the world we inhabit and the hidden vulnerabilities that bind us together as a society. This case was never merely a sensational chronicle of blood and malice. It was a profound systemic failure, a terrifying masterclass in manipulation, and a heartbreaking reminder of how easily the brightest futures can be swallowed by the darkest shadows when a community looks away from those who need protection the most. The boys who walked into that house did not do so because they were reckless or abandoned to the world. They walked in because they trusted, because they were young and eager for connection, and because the monster who awaited them wore the comforting, disarming mask of a friendly neighbor who handed out sweets and smiled warmly in the sunlight. That profound betrayal of trust remains the most chilling element of the entire tragedy, a haunting precedent that forever altered how subsequent generations perceive the world around them, stripping away the naive assumption that evil always announces itself with a snarl and a dark alleyway. Instead, the Houston mass murders taught a brutal, unforgiving lesson that the most destructive predators often walk comfortably in the daylight, integrating seamlessly into civic life while harboring desires so grotesque that the human mind instinctively rejects their existence until reality strikes hard against our collective complacency and forces us to wake up from ignorance forever today and always remember them. The institutional awakening that followed the exhumations at the boat shed and along the coastal sands forced law enforcement agencies across the entire nation to overhaul their fundamental approaches to missing persons investigations, dismantling the lazy paradigms that had previously dismissed vulnerable teenagers as simple runaways and replacing them with rigorous protocols designed to ensure that no future generation of youth would ever be so readily abandoned by the very institutions sworn to protect their safety. Yet, despite all the administrative reforms, the forensic advancements, and the decades of legal reckoning, the core of the sorrow remains untouched, anchored permanently in the empty spaces left behind in the homes of grieving families who never truly recovered from the sudden, violent theft of their sons. The mothers and fathers who spent their remaining years waiting for answers, the siblings who grew up in the heavy shadow of an unspoken grief, and the community that was forced to lose its collective innocence all bear witness to an enduring legacy of pain that no amount of judicial sentencing or historical analysis can ever fully erase or mend. It is for this reason that the memory of those 28 young men must be preserved with unwavering dignity and profound respect, ensuring that they are remembered not merely as statistics in a true crime ledger, but as vibrant, complex human beings with dreams, aspirations, and entire lifetimes stolen away by a calculated cruelty that defies all human reason and compassion. In recounting their stories, we do not indulge in the morbid fascination of violence, but rather we reaffirm our shared moral obligation to bear witness to the darkest chapters of human experience, to honor the fragile resilience of those who survived, and to maintain an eternal, unyielding vigilance against silent horrors that take root when we fail to pay attention to the world around us without looking away from truth forever now. The true crime narrative is ultimately an exercise in empathy, a solemn journey into the abyss that demands we emerge with a deeper understanding of our collective fragility and a renewed commitment to safeguarding the vulnerable among us from the predators who wait patiently in plain sight. As this dark chapter closes, we leave behind the ghosts of the Houston Heights, resting eternally in the uneasy peace of history, wrapped in the solemn remembrance of a society that learned too late how fragile the light of youth truly is when exposed to the unrelenting cold of a monster's heart. Across the decades that separate our modern era from the grim reality of 1973, the lessons of this horrific chapter continue to resonate with a sobering clarity that transcends the boundaries of time and geography. We are reminded that the societal structures we build to keep ourselves secure are only as strong as our collective willingness to listen, to observe, and to question the comfortable illusions that allow darkness to flourish behind closed doors in otherwise quiet suburban neighborhoods. The psychological scars inflicted upon the city of Houston and upon the broader consciousness of the American public serve as a permanent testament to the cost of complacency, ensuring that we remain forever mindful of the subtle ways in which trust can be weaponized against the innocent. When we honor the victims of the Candyman, we do so not by dwelling endlessly upon the depravity of their destruction, but by committing ourselves fully to the preservation of human dignity, demanding transparency from our institutions, and fostering genuine care for every young person seeking their place in a complex world. The shadows cast by those fateful summer events will never truly vanish, but they serve as a perpetual guiding light, warning us away from indifference and guiding our steps forward toward lasting safety and eternal vigilance. Now and always remember them. The legacy of Elmer Wayne Henley Jr. and David Owen Brooks, alongside the terrifying phantom of Dean Corll, remains etched into the foundational lore of criminal psychology as a dark benchmark of how deeply human relationships can be corrupted when moral boundaries are systematically dismantled by a master manipulator. Their actions forced criminologists, sociologists, and legal scholars to re-examine the intricate dynamics of adolescent grooming, peer betrayal, and the profound economic and social pressures that drive young people into the perilous margins of urban life, where predatory individuals lie in wait. The shockwaves of the Houston mass murders reshaped the investigative methodologies of law enforcement agencies, giving rise to modern multi-agency cooperation, advanced genetic identification techniques, and a standardized refusal to overlook the plight of missing juveniles. Yet, behind all the technological progress and the institutional evolution lies the unyielding human cost, a debt of sorrow paid in full by families whose lives were fractured beyond repair on the altar of an unspeakable evil. We carry forward the burden of their stories as an ethical mandate, ensuring that the names of the lost are never swallowed by the silence of time, and that the mistakes of an apathetic era are never repeated by a society that has learned the hard way how vital it is to protect its children from the monsters who are the faces of friends. In remembering them, we fulfill our highest duty as chroniclers of the human condition, standing steadfast against the darkness and vowing to keep the memory of the innocent burning brightly against the long night of history, while we strive every day to build a safer and more compassionate world for all future generations to inherit with courage and grace now and evermore, without ever forgetting the precious souls lost to the darkness of that terrible summer in 1973 across the wide expanse of the great state of Texas. As we reach the final horizon of this harrowing exploration into one of the darkest abysses of American history, we are left standing in the quiet stillness that follows a profound storm, contemplating the fragile balance between light and shadow that defines our existence. The terrifying summer of 1973 in Houston, Texas, will forever remain a cautionary tale of institutional failure, community blindness, and the catastrophic cost of unheeded warning signs, challenging every generation to remain vigilant against the quiet horrors that hide behind smiles and pleasant suburban facades. The 28 young men whose futures were stolen away in rooms designed for agony now rest in the permanent keeping of history, their identities restored through modern science, and their memories enshrined in the collective conscience of a nation that refuses to forget their suffering or diminish the value of their brief lives. We close this comprehensive narrative not with a sense of closure, but with a solemn realization that the fight against cruelty, indifference, and predation requires our constant, unwavering attention, our deepest empathy, and our unyielding dedication to truth and justice. The ghosts of the heights have taught us a devastating lesson about the price of complacency, leaving behind an indelible mark on the true crime landscape and reminding us forevermore of the sacred duty we share to protect one another in a world that can so easily turn dark when good people fail to look closely enough at the quiet corners where evil sleeps under the blinding light of day, whispering promises of candy and friendship while holding a knife in the dark shadows of deceit that linger silently across the decades as an eternal warning to every watchful soul who walks beneath the open Texas sky seeking safety, peace, and an enduring light to guide our shared human journey forward into the unwritten future with absolute grace and unwavering moral clarity forever and ever from now. The passage of time, while often regarded as a gentle healer that blurs the edges of historical trauma, has in the case of the Houston mass murders served as an instrument of unyielding revelation, dragging long-buried secrets back into the light through the relentless advancement of modern science. Even as decades slipped away since that stifling August morning in 1973, the grim accounting of Dean Corll's atrocities was not entirely finished, because among the 28 recovered bodies, there remained human remains that defied the primitive forensic capabilities of the era in which they were exhumed. For many years, forensic pathologists and local law enforcement officers stared at cold case files containing anonymized case numbers, dental charts, and faded photographs of clothing fragments, knowing full well that behind those sterile bureaucratic designations were real human beings, young boys who had mothers, fathers, brothers, and sisters waiting in a permanent purgatory of uncertainty. The tragedy of a missing child is a unique and agonizing psychological torture, but the tragedy of an unidentified victim buried anonymously in a forgotten grave is a wound that refuses to scar over, lingering like an unlit candle in the vast darkness of history. It was this lingering injustice that spurred a new generation of forensic specialists, genetic genealogists, and dedicated investigators to pick up the torch, refusing to let the nameless dead remain forgotten casualties of a bygone era. They understood that technological progress carries a profound moral obligation, a duty to use every tool available in the modern arsenal to give these forgotten souls back their true identities and to offer their surviving families the long-overdue peace of a proper farewell. This modern renaissance in cold case resolution was spearheaded by the revolutionary breakthroughs of forensic DNA phenotyping and investigative genetic genealogy, methodologies that transform tiny, degraded bone fragments into windows opening directly into the past. Laboratories equipped with cutting-edge sequencing technologies began extracting viable genetic material from skeletal remains that had spent decades resting in municipal archives and medical examiner vaults. By comparing these recovered genetic profiles against vast commercial genealogical databases and working backward through family trees with meticulous precision, forensic experts were able to pierce the veil of anonymity that had shrouded several of the Corll victims for nearly half a century. Each successful identification was not merely a scientific triumph. It was a profound human restoration, a moment where a cold case number was crossed out and replaced by a living, breathing name. A boy who loved baseball, who argued with his siblings, who had a favorite song, and whose life was violently stolen away in the prime of his youth. These modern breakthroughs demonstrated with stunning clarity that history is never entirely silent, and that the passage of time cannot erase the intrinsic dignity of a human life, no matter how hard a monster tried to obliterate their existence and hide their remains beneath the shifting sands of the Texas coast or the damp earth of a Southwest Houston boat shed. The emotional shockwaves that rippled outward whenever a long-lost victim was finally identified after decades of silence served as a powerful reminder that grief does not expire with the turning of the calendar years. When investigators knocked on the doors of aging siblings or elderly parents to deliver the definitive news that their missing brother or son had finally been found among the victims of the Candyman, they reopened doors that had been locked away behind decades of protective psychological numbness. For these families, the revelation brought a heartbreaking finality, replacing the agonizing hope that their loved one might still be out there somewhere with the crushing, yet clarifying, reality of permanent loss. Yet, in that sorrow, there was also a measure of profound relief, the knowledge that they were no longer walking in the dark, that their boy had not simply vanished into thin air, and that his memory could finally be honored with a headstone bearing his true name. These emotional homecomings underscored the enduring resilience of human love, proving that familial bonds possess a tenacity that outlasts even the most horrific acts of violence, bridging the decades with a quiet, unwavering devotion that refuses to let the dead be forgotten by the world they left behind so abruptly. As the physical landscape of Houston continued to evolve, sweeping away old buildings and replacing quiet residential streets with the sprawling infrastructure of a modern metropolis, the physical spaces tied to the massacre underwent their own transformation. The house where the horrors occurred was eventually modified, and the surrounding neighborhood of the Heights grew into a vibrant, eclectic community where new generations of families built their lives, largely unaware of the subterranean history buried beneath their feet. Yet, the ghosts of 1973 remained woven into the architectural DNA of the city, serving as a cautionary cornerstone in the collective memory of local residents who understood that even the most picturesque neighborhoods can harbor unfathomable darkness behind closed doors. The evolution of the city stands as a testament to the resilience of human communities, showing how life pushes forward, building parks, schools, and homes over the very ground where tears once fell and innocence was lost, while simultaneously maintaining a quiet, solemn respect for the historical gravity of what transpired during that infamous summer. This delicate balance between moving forward and remembering the past is essential for a society seeking to heal without forgetting the lessons hard-won through unimaginable suffering. The ongoing process of identification and historical remembrance serves as a vital bridge connecting our modern world to the dark legacy of the Houston mass murders, ensuring that the true crime narrative remains grounded not in the morbid sensationalism of violence, but in the profound dignity of the victims and the unwavering pursuit of justice. Every time a name is restored, every time a forensic report is updated, and every time a new generation learns the cautionary history of the Candyman, we reaffirm our collective commitment to protecting the vulnerable and maintaining an eternal vigilance against the quiet complacency that allows evil to flourish in plain sight. The ghosts of the Heights will forever haunt the margins of American criminal history, standing as a permanent reminder of how easily trust can be corrupted and how fragile the light of youth truly is when exposed to the unrelenting cold of a predator's heart. Yet, in their memory, we find a renewed sense of purpose, a moral imperative to listen when warning signs appear, to support our communities with genuine empathy, and to ensure that no child is ever again left defenseless against the hidden monsters who walk among us in the bright daylight, waiting for a chance to strike before the world wakes up to the nightmare unfolding right next door. As we arrive at the final horizon of this extensive and harrowing exploration into one of the darkest chapters of American criminal history, we are left standing in the profound stillness that inevitably follows a devastating storm. The journey through the grim realities of the Houston mass murders has demanded an unflinching look at the absolute limits of human depravity, the fragile architecture of societal trust, and the catastrophic cost of institutional complacency. Over the course of these chapters, we have walked the sunlit streets of the Houston Heights, peered behind the polite facade of a seemingly respectable candy maker, descended into the subterranean nightmares of rented boat sheds, and witnessed the sudden, violent implosion of a reign of terror that silently consumed the lives of 28 young men. This comprehensive chronicle was never designed to pander to the morbid fascinations of violence, but rather to serve as a solemn, respectful monument to the victims whose futures were stolen away, and as a stark, unyielding reminder of the eternal vigilance required to protect the vulnerable from the hidden predators who walk among us in the bright daylight. The legacy of Dean Arnold Corll, David Owen Brooks, and Elmer Wayne Henley Jr. remains forever etched into the foundational lore of true crime as a cautionary benchmark, challenging every subsequent generation to examine the comfortable illusions of safety that allow evil to flourish behind closed doors in otherwise quiet neighborhoods where neighbors wave hello and children play, without a care in the world until the sudden, brutal shock of reality shatters their innocence forever, leaving Behind a permanent scar on the collective conscience of a nation that learned through unimaginable sorrow how quickly the light of youth can be extinguished when good people choose to look away from the subtle warning signs of danger lingering quietly just beyond the edge of their immediate awareness. The true significance of revisiting these harrowing events extends far beyond the historical documentation of a serial killer's crimes. It lies in the ongoing evolution of our collective empathy and our institutional commitment to justice. The systemic failures that permitted a predator to operate with absolute impunity for 3 agonizing years, the dismissal of missing teenagers as mere runaways, the bureaucratic apathy of an overwhelmed police force, and the tragic isolation of working-class families desperately searching for answers in the dark, forced a necessary and revolutionary transformation in how modern society handles the welfare of its youth. Law enforcement agencies across the globe adopted sophisticated multi-agency cooperation models, advanced genetic identification techniques, and a standardized refusal to overlook the plight of missing juveniles, ensuring that no future generation of young people would ever be so readily abandoned by the very institutions sworn to protect their safety. Yet, behind all the technological progress, the forensic breakthroughs, and the courtroom verdicts lies an unyielding human debt, an ocean of sorrow paid in full by families whose lives were fractured beyond repair on the altar of an unspeakable evil. We carry forward the burden of their stories as an ethical mandate, ensuring that the names of the lost are never swallowed by the silence of time, and that the mistakes of an apathetic era are never repeated by a society that has learned the hard way how vital it is to protect its children from the monsters who are the faces of friends. In remembering them, we fulfill our highest duty as chroniclers of the human condition, standing steadfast against the darkness and vowing to keep the memory of the innocent burning brightly against the long night of history while we strive every day to build a safer and more compassionate world for all future generations to inherit with courage and grace now and evermore, without ever forgetting the precious souls lost to the darkness of that terrible summer in 1973 across the wide expanse of the great state of Texas. The philosophical resonance of the Houston mass murders forces us to confront a deeply unsettling truth about the nature of evil in human society, that it does not always announce itself with a snarl or lurk exclusively in the shadows of deserted alleyways, but can seamlessly integrate itself into the very fabric of daily civic life, hiding behind the polite smile of a local businessman and weaponizing the trusted peer groups of its victims. This realization challenges the comforting myth that monsters are easily recognizable outsiders, proving instead that the most destructive threats often wear the mask of absolute normalcy, exploiting our natural inclination to trust the familiar and to assume the best of those who live next door. The psychological scars inflicted upon the city of Houston and upon the broader consciousness of the American public serve as a permanent testament to the cost of such complacency, ensuring that we remain forever mindful of the subtle ways in which trust can be manipulated against the innocent. When we honor the victims of the Candyman, we do so not by dwelling endlessly upon the depravity of their destruction, but by committing ourselves fully to the preservation of human dignity, demanding transparency from our institutions, and fostering genuine care for every young person seeking their place in a complex and often overwhelming world. The shadows cast by those fateful summer events will never truly vanish from the landscape of true crime history, but they serve as a perpetual guiding light, warning us away from indifference and guiding our steps forward toward lasting safety, mutual understanding, and eternal vigilance against the quiet horrors that take root when we fail to pay attention to the world around us without looking away from truth forever now. As we bring this 10-part narrative to its definitive close, we are left standing in the quiet stillness of historical reflection, contemplating the delicate balance between light and shadow that defines our shared human existence. The terrifying summer of 1973 in Houston, Texas, will forever remain a profound cautionary tale of institutional failure, community blindness, and the catastrophic cost of unheeded warning signs, challenging every subsequent generation to remain vigilant against the quiet horrors that hide behind smiles and pleasant suburban facades. The 28 young men whose futures were stolen away in rooms designed for agony now rest in the permanent keeping of history, their identities restored through modern science, and their memories enshrined in the collective conscience of a nation that refuses to forget their suffering or diminish the value of their brief, beautiful lives. We close this comprehensive chronicle not with a sense of easy closure, but with a solemn realization that the fight against cruelty, indifference, and predation requires our constant, unwavering attention, our deepest empathy, and our unyielding dedication to truth and justice. The ghosts of the heights have taught us a devastating lesson about the price of complacency, leaving behind an indelible mark on the true crime landscape and reminding us forevermore of the sacred duty we share to protect one another in a world that can so easily turn dark when good people fail to look closely enough at the quiet corners where evil sleeps under the blinding light of day, whispering promises of candy and friendship while holding a knife in the dark shadows of deceit that linger silently across the decades as an eternal warning to every watchful soul who walks beneath the open Texas sky seeking safety, peace, and an enduring light to guide our shared human journey forward into the unwritten future with absolute grace and unwavering moral clarity forever and ever from now. The preservation of historical archives pertaining to the Houston mass murders represents a crucial responsibility for institutions tasked with documenting the darkest chapters of human experience. When decades pass and the immediate emotional shockwaves of a tragedy recede into the background of cultural memory, the raw documentation, the police reports, the forensic photographs, the trial transcripts, and the audio recordings of interrogations remains as an unyielding testament to the reality of what transpired. These documents are not merely relics to be locked away in dusty government vaults. They are foundational cautionary texts that teach future generations of criminologists, law enforcement officers, and legal scholars about the subtle indicators of predatory behavior and the catastrophic costs of institutional complacency. Historians and researchers who comb through these extensive archives are repeatedly struck by the sheer volume of missed opportunities, the bureaucratic oversights, and the societal blind spots that allowed a monstrous enterprise to flourish for years in plain sight. By maintaining open access to these records while fiercely protecting the dignity of the victims, society ensures that the lessons bought with the lives of 28 young men are never forgotten or minimized by the passage of time. The archives stand as a permanent institutional mirror, reflecting both the failures of the past and the ongoing evolution of a legal and investigative apparatus striving to become more vigilant, more empathetic, and infinitely more responsive to the silent cries of the vulnerable before a tragedy can take root in our neighborhoods. Beyond the formal archives and the institutional lessons lies the deeply personal, ongoing journey of healing and remembrance experienced by the families and communities whose lives were fractured on that humid August morning in 1973. For the brothers, sisters, mothers, and fathers who survived the tempest, grief is not a linear process with a definitive endpoint. It is a permanent companion, a quiet sorrow that weaves itself into the fabric of daily existence. The annual cycles of birthdays, holidays, and anniversaries serve as poignant reminders of futures stolen away, of potential unfulfilled, and of empty chairs that could never truly be filled. Yet, within this landscape of enduring sorrow, there has also emerged a remarkable resilience, a quiet determination among family members and local advocates to ensure that the memory of the victims is honored not with despair, but with a profound and active commitment to remembrance. Memorials, private gatherings, and grassroots efforts to support missing children and troubled youth have sprung up across the years, transforming an unspeakable tragedy into a catalyst for community compassion and proactive protection. These efforts demonstrate that human love possesses a tenacious, indomitable quality capable of outlasting even the most profound atrocities, bridging the chasms of time with a steadfast devotion that refuses to let the innocent fade into historical obscurity. The cultural resonance of the case also forced a fundamental transformation in how society engages with true crime narratives, steering the genre away from exploitative sensationalism toward a more empathetic, victim-centered approach that prioritizes human dignity over morbid fascination. In the decades following the exposure of Dean Corll's crimes, the public appetite for true crime stories grew exponentially, yet the ethical framework governing how these stories are told underwent a much-needed evolution. Creators, journalists, and documentarians began to recognize the profound responsibility they carry when examining historical atrocities, shifting their focus away from glorifying perpetrators and toward honoring the lives, the struggles, and the enduring legacies of the victims and their families. This ethical shift ensures that when stories of unimaginable horror are brought to light, they serve a higher purpose: educating the public, supporting systemic reform, and amplifying the voices of those who were silenced by violence. The Houston mass murders became a critical touchstone in this evolution, reminding storytellers that behind every cold case number, every forensic report, and every police file is a human being with a family, a history, and a future that was violently erased, demanding a level of respect, nuance, and emotional gravity that honors the sanctity of life above all else. The psychological footprint of the case on the city of Houston and the broader American psyche serves as a permanent reminder of the fragility of community trust and the critical importance of maintaining vigilance against the subtle, insidious ways in which predatory individuals integrate themselves into civic life. The realization that a mild-mannered candy maker could conceal such profound depravity behind a polite smile and a generous facade challenged the foundational assumptions of suburban safety, leaving behind a legacy of cautious awareness that persists to this day. People learned that evil does not always wear the face of a stranger lurking in the dark, but can sometimes reside comfortably next door, participating in neighborhood life while harboring desires that defy human comprehension. This sobering truth altered how communities interact, encouraging a healthier balance between neighborly trust and protective watchfulness, ensuring that parents, educators, and local leaders remain attuned to the warning signs of alienation and vulnerability among young people. The shadows cast by the heights continue to whisper a timeless warning across the decades, reminding us that the safety of our neighborhoods is not guaranteed by geography or economic status, but by our collective willingness to pay attention, to listen when children speak of trouble, and to refuse to look away when something feels fundamentally wrong beneath the surface of everyday normalcy. As we bring this comprehensive exploration to its ultimate and definitive close, we stand once more in the quiet stillness of historical reflection, looking back across the vast expanse of time that separates our modern world from the stifling summer of 1973. The 28 young men whose lives were so cruelly extinguished now rest in the permanent keeping of history, their identities restored through the miracles of modern science, and their memories enshrined in the collective conscience of a society that refuses to let their stories be forgotten in the rush of progress. We honor them not by dwelling endlessly upon the darkness of their destruction, but by committing ourselves fully to the preservation of human dignity, the pursuit of truth, and the unwavering defense of the vulnerable against the hidden predators who still walk among us in the bright daylight. The legacy of the Houston mass murders remains an eternal, haunting beacon warning us away from complacency, guiding our steps forward with a renewed sense of empathy, moral clarity, and an unyielding dedication to building a safer, more compassionate world for all future generations to inherit with courage, grace, and eternal vigilance now and evermore from this day forward.